86% of women say that they want a man to make the first move. 50% of men are scared of making the first move for being seen as creepy. And 20% of Gen Z say that a man approaching a woman in person always or usually constitutes harassment. They're scared of being seen as creepy. They're concerned that they're going to either upset this girl or that they're going to be part of some Me Too scandal.
How accurate are these stats? It's another episode of These Are Not Facts, they're just things you made up to justify your feelings. Despite the fact that Chris Williamson loves to repeat these statistics at every opportunity, he never sources any of them. The narrative he's pushing here is entirely bogus, and he's aware of that. I was unable to find a source for the claim that 86% of women say they want men to make the first move. In fact, it looks like the first time it is used is in this tweet from August of last year from Chris himself. And he presents a number of these statistics to present this tension between women wanting men to approach more and men scared of being accused of sexual harassment, concluding this is a difficult circle to square. Well, that might be because he's intentionally leaving out half the story. It could well be true that 86% of women want men to make the first move because men say the same thing about women. A 2017 survey by Match.com revealed that single men are overwhelmingly in favor of women initiating the first kiss, 95%, as well as initiating sex for the first time, 93%. The vast majority of men are also pleased if a woman asks for a man's phone number, 95%, and is the first to call after a good first date, 94%. That almost 90% of women want men to make the first move isn't meaningful when 90% of men say the same thing about women. It's almost as if this is a nuanced conversation, one with many layers, one that doesn't easily lend itself to simplistic black and white man versus woman thinking with a singular root cause. But by goodness, that doesn't stop Chris from just wedging one right in there and letting us all know who he thinks is to blame. It's mostly 41-year-old plus women in charge of publishing in female-led media. They promote a narrative discouraging men from approaching women because that's not what they desire, without realizing younger women want it to happen more. Ah yes, it's bitter middle-aged single women ruining the fun for everyone. Again, no sources for any of this, it's just vibes and feelings. And despite the fact that Chris objects to twisting these facts to support a narrative discouraging men from approaching, just a few months later he was doing exactly that when he appeared on the Iced Coffee Hour podcast, and said that 76% of men are scared to make the first move for fear of being seen as creepy. So is it 50% or is it 76%? Chris seems unsure, and this is not the only one of his stats to get reworked over time. In the opening clip, he claimed that 20% of Gen Z say that a man approaching a woman always or usually constitutes harassment. But in the tweet, the original claim was that 17% of 18 to 29-year-old Americans said that inviting a woman out for a drink always or usually constitutes harassment, showing he's the one that's more than willing to massage some of his claims in order to push a narrative. The stat comes from this YouGov poll from 2017. And what he left out was that men are more likely than women to say that inviting a woman out for a drink always or usually constitutes harassment. 8% of women, 9% of men. There's also a more recent version of this poll from 2019, where only 3% of Gen Z felt that this always or usually constitutes harassment, but 15% of millennials. And again, men were more likely to say this than women. 3/4 of women also said that a man inviting her out for a drink was either flattering, acceptable, or didn't have strong feelings about it. So it's 15%, not 20%, it's millennials, not Gen Z, it's inviting a woman out for a drink, not simply approaching a woman. The majority of women are comfortable with it, and men are more likely than women to say that it constitutes harassment. Which obviously completely undermines the narrative that modern dating is a minefield for men, but it is the third stat where this deceit and manipulation is most egregious. Chris uses two similar versions in the original tweet. 55% of single men aged 18 to 30 say they haven't approached a woman in the last year, and 50% of men report not wanting to approach a woman for fear of being seen as creepy or predatory. Now again, there's no source listed, nor could I find one, but at the bottom of the tweet, Chris gives out a hat tip to Alexander of Date Psych, who is a cognitive and behavioral neuroscience researcher, who educates on dating, relationships, and psychology, posting data that disputes and debunks a lot of red pill mythology. Just a few weeks before Chris posted his tweet, Alexander had posted his findings on risk aversion and dating, finding in all age groups surveyed, almost half of men had not approached a woman in the last year. And Alexander was keen to point out that this data wasn't just concerning cold approaches, say approaching a stranger at a bar, but also included friends, co-workers, classmates. Men aren't just not approaching women they don't know, they're also not approaching women they do know very well. He also looked at the reasons why men were not approaching women. And the major reason was not fear of being seen as creepy or being accused of harassment, it was fear of rejection, with fear of social consequences next. In fact, fear of legal consequences was the lowest reason listed, with less than 10% of the non-black-pilled male sample citing it as a reason. Men are 3 times more likely to say that not finding a woman attractive enough to approach is the barrier. And Chris knows this because he had Alexander as a guest on his Modern Wisdom podcast in November of last year, where Alexander explained it wasn't due to fear of harassment and Me Too, but what he did find was that men who approached tended to be less risk-averse. Meanwhile, men who didn't approach tended to be more risk-averse, and that among incel and black-pilled men, they trended towards greater risk aversion. It isn't the powerful forces of society at large that explain young male singledom. It's much more mundane. Men just aren't even trying. It's personal behaviors and attitudes that can be addressed and overcome. And in the podcast, upon hearing this, Chris responds that this is a serious white pill for why you should approach women. So it is wild to see him use, I presume, the same data to draw the opposite conclusion. It's another way in which the manosphere manipulates data in order to spread misinformation, an example of the Motte and Bailey. The Motte and Bailey is where you start from an entirely reasonable, defensible position. Say that 50% of men haven't approached a woman in the last year. Perfectly fine. But then you build on your argument. You add scaffolding that isn't supported by data to make a more controversial and broader point. 50% of men are scared of making the first move because they're going to upset her or be part of some Me Too scandal. Something that isn't supported by the data at all. And being more controversial, it gets more engagement and more clicks. And the red pill men who already feel this way and are very vocal about it add in their support. You come along and you see a bunch of podcasts all saying the same thing and a ton of comments all in agreement, and suddenly you become more risk averse. Nobody likes to be rejected for sure, but the thought of legal consequences sounds terrifying. You hadn't really thought about it. But clearly other people have. It's why it's all these podcasts can talk about. And if dozens of them are repeating it, then surely someone somewhere along the way did the due diligence, so it must be accurate and true. And without that check, it all becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. Chris is telling you that the majority of men are worried about this, which sounds important, so you should be worried about this. So you group up with other men who are worried about this, so you can learn more and protect yourself from this thing that is very worrying. So now there's a group of you, and it seems like a lot of men are worried about this. And so you want to be helpful, and you want to share that information with other men. Hey guys, here's this thing you should worry about that a lot of us are really concerned about. And then people point to you and say, hey, this guy's worried about this thing, and all of his friends are too. This must be a big problem. But the flimsy defenses never get tested. We never tear down the scaffolding to get to the truth at the core. We ask, is this accurate? We assume they're telling the truth unless somebody else comes along and puts in the work to debunk it. Instead, we should be insisting that they put in the work to convince us they are telling the truth. And if they can't cite their sources and their claims constantly change, then we need to stop giving them the benefit of the doubt. Assume that this is deliberate manipulation designed to promote a biased agenda.